Right, thank you everybody. As I said before, when everybody was shuffling to the back, the whole point of us keeping this quite small is that we can have a conversation. I want you guys to get involved. It's not us presenting to you, we've got no slides. So we're going to talk a bit about hyperautomation. If you've got questions, if you don't understand any of the terms that are used, if you've got questions relating to anything that's been said, please put your hand up. We'll grab the question and we'll go through it at the same time. So, you don't feel like you just have to sit there and listen. You can get involved. That's hopefully the way it'll work. And we'll take it from there. So, welcome to our event. Welcome to our event. It's the road to hyperautomation, how businesses are automating their way to success. There's been a lot of talk over the last, couple of years, Gartner, Forrester, and we talked to a lot of customers about some of their challenges. So what have they been tasked with? What have they been asked to deliver? And it's a lot about speed of delivery. It's about cost reduction, improving customer experience, their internal customers as well as their external customers. And so people are challenged with that. I don't know if that sounds familiar to anybody here, the same sort of challenges everybody has here. And so one of the key ways that that's been addressed is through integration and automation. So we've really tried to bring that to life with some of the expert panelists we've got here. They'll talk about some of the technology that's available, some of the projects and some of the challenges that we've gone through and how we went about them. And then we've got customers at the sides. We'll meet them later. And we can hear some war stories, and you can we'll hear what's gone well, what could have done better, what didn't go well, and you get a chance to ask questions. Feel free to ask questions. The guys are willing to answer questions. Yes, good. Willing to answer questions and talk about some of their experiences. So, to my right, our industry experts. We've got Aaron Perrott, CTO of KTSL, and we've got Keith Rigg, who is the VP of Technology from Jitterbit. We're going to go through about 40 minutes listening to Aaron and Keith, and I'll try and prompt them with some questions as well. After that, we'll have a little break, a quick 10 minutes, grab a drink, and then we'll invite our customers up who will talk to us about a couple of the projects that they've gone through. Okay? Right. Aaron, let's kick this
Hello.
So, I guess, first of all, you've got to be, before you can address anything, build a plan, you've got to understand what's the opportunity, where is the opportunity, what is right for automation, how would you go about that?
I think first of all it's important to identify the right candidate. So what you're looking for there really is volume is the first thing, because where you get the most benefit out of automation is by taking things that you do repeatedly and again and again and again. So first of all, it's about identifying the right volume for your business. The second thing is complexity, because the more complex the task, the more opportunity there is for something to go wrong, and therefore what you want to try to do is bring standardization into that to make sure it's repeatable again and again. And they're the two main criteria, because that then allows you to form a business case, because there's no point automating something that you're only doing 2 or 3 times. There's no structure to the business case there, and then you're not going to gain the level of repeatability that you really need. Also, with the advent of operations technology, so changes the way that AI ops is working now, that's bringing more opportunity to drive automation. And sometimes when we refer to hyper-automation, we're really just talking about the speed to do that automation or that integration. That's what that term means, that's where it's come from. So typically we've looked at automation as a means to say, let's do a case exchange, let's share data between customer A, B and C. Let's automate some of our more complex internal processes. But now you can look beyond that. What you're looking for really is if AI is spotting an anomaly or something that's happening, say, within your operations sphere, why don't you automate that as well? Rather than calling somebody out at 3 in the morning to restart a server, there's no benefit there. You can get something to do that for you. So the remit now is a lot wider, and that gives you much more opportunity to formulate a wider business case for the adoption of that technology. Because once you've got the platform, it's then about leveraging it and trying to use as much as you can through it. So some of the ways to identify those use cases, you've got historical ways of doing it, so looking at your case management tool, looking at the load that you're getting, looking at the type of instance you're receiving, or the types of requests that you're getting, because they will typically formulate things that you can automate. And some will be obvious, so shared drive access, password reset, application access, those types of typical high volume, low hanging fruit, good things to automate. They're very consistent, easy to spot. They're the sort of your starting points. But you can go a little bit more in depth now. So a lot of customers will be using things like proactive problem management that may be driven through AI. That's another great way of identifying use cases that you can use and push out into the automation sphere. On top of that, you've also got sort of a rise in what's known as a DEX tool. So for people who aren't familiar with the term DEX, it's a user experience measurement tool that sits on laptops and desktops. And that will capture things that you previously couldn't, like slow website load times, slow opportunity to access applications. So this is where end users might be struggling, but you can take that monitoring and then turn that into something that then spawns a better user experience. So a good example, we've been working with a recent customer. We identified that they had a continuous issue with one of their banking applications. And it turned out it was to do with particular time. It was when most people get paid, so there's no real correlation there, but that's when they saw it. So it was the end of the month, they had to spawn the application, not massively, but slightly slower. You're getting half a second slower response times. That was getting measured by the DEX tool that was embedded inside their phone application. Pick that up. What we do, call an automation, expand the capacity within that application during those time scales. That gives a better user experience. You saved that half a second. And it sounds like something quite small, but when you're in a very user-driven environment where people are getting less patient around waiting for the application to respond, that suddenly becomes quite important because you don't want them to move to another bank. You know, you want to retain your customers. But it's a good example where I think the use cases have moved a lot further forward than maybe the traditional places we would have looked, where we were relying quite a lot on probably an internal understanding of where my volume was. You've now got a massive opportunity to seek where that volume is across different areas of your business, and that then gives you a better opportunity to leverage a hyperautomation platform and to make the most of it.
Okay, that makes sense. Makes sense. Everybody here? Any questions? Feel free to jump in. Okay, so if that's an example of, if that's an example of those maybe in the banking industry, Barry, what makes a good candidate from your perspective? You know, from your experience, maybe done this a few times as well.
Keith,
sorry. You can be Keith today. That's fine.
I can pretend to be Barry if it helps. No, but Aaron's answer was excellent, very comprehensive. He mentioned two things at the beginning of his answer around the volume of transactions and also if the tasks are repetitive and then trying to have that scaling factor. But I would also say, and I'm talking generically now and trying to stay away from specific AI ops ITSM use cases because we have a broad view from our perspective as an integration vendor. But if the business transactions have a high value attached to it, might be monetary or they're business critical, then they would also be other indicators as to why you should perhaps look to automate, drive the error rate down to as low as possible, ideally zero. But it also depends on whether or not the business and the view of the business process, if there's an appetite for risk there or not, what the risk tolerance is like, what is an acceptable error rate. It's not always practical to drive the error rate down to zero, but obviously we should be striving to see a marked improvement over the current way of working. We'll probably touch on it later, but hyperautomation doesn't mean a completely autonomous process. Aaron touched on things like self-service and instant fulfillment, which can be done if we have AI and RPA and other automation tools bound together by an integration platform. But it can be and should be often with key touch points by humans to safeguard mission critical processes. So you can still achieve a high degree of automation. It doesn't have to be completely autonomous, but just some other ways to look at how you would identify potential use cases in the business. Process mining, I think, is great, especially the user experience piece, but you can also dig into your line of business systems, whatever that system of record may be, and start to look for where you see blockages or backlogs in the execution of that process chain. So I would say once you start to go cross-domain and cross-functions within the organisation, it's even more important that you have that end-to-end automation. It's typically when it leaves one person's control or one department's control is when no one person or entity sees how bad something is end to end because it's going from one person's field of view to another. and it's only really the consumers of that service that have a true appreciation as to how good or bad it is. So try to look at it from the outside in, not the inside out. Try to look cross-functionally, and then there might be opportunities to rationalise your landscape whilst at the same time looking to drive up automation levels.
Yeah, and I think Keith makes a really good point there around focusing on your critical business systems, because one of the other drivers is also compliance. So for most organisations, things like DORA and IS2, which are quite pertinent right at the moment because they're changing this year. A lot of customers need to drive for either the October deadline or the January deadline for compliance in those areas. That's going to be focusing on your critical business services or your VBSs first, and there'll be some massive opportunity for automation to drive compliance. Audit takes time and it's difficult, but it's repeatable. Typically what an auditor is looking for is the same type of metrics again and again. So again, it's another good opportunity to leverage automation to drive out some of the things that are typically harder to get the dev team to focus on, or harder sometimes for the business to provide those metrics. There's a good opportunity for that. And tying into what Keith said, that's a mix of that business process alongside that technical deployment in order to make sure that you do hit that compliance and you can prove it quickly, because that saves time in terms of that audit. And there's loads of opportunity to leverage automation to do that and to push out those results straight to the business. So you're not doing what is quite a heavy lifting task every time that comes around.
Okay. And so if that's the kind of opportunity, the art of the possible, what's the next steps then? You kind of identify those opportunities. What's the next step? How do you build your strategy for a delivery?
I think the first thing is to put in place a good governance framework for what's going to be your automation or your integration strategy. You don't want to look at it as if I'm going to do one or two and then I'm going to drop it, because you don't really get the leverage from putting in a platform and spending the effort to start to build on top of that platform by doing one or two integrations. You start to get the value when you extend that into 10, 20, 30 different integrations, and you start to get that consistency across the business. But what you have to do is make sure you get your standards right up front. So for a lot of customers, that might be making sure you've got a good governance framework, you're picking the right, back to the point, you have to pick the right use cases, so you're flowing them through a governance to make sure you're doing the right thing. But when you start to do that delivery and implementation, you're reusing where you've done something before. So for example, if you've integrated into system B before, you're not going to start that from scratch. You would have done security, you would have done the initial authentication, you would have brokered that conversation, so reuse it. You want to make sure you've got good controls there, so what you're not doing is getting project one doing it in one way, project two doing it in another way, because again, you're not really saving the time. The point of a middleware platform, or the point of moving into automation at scale, is to get as much reuse as you can. And you need good governance to do that, good control, not at the detriment of speed of delivery, because obviously the whole point of being able to do hyperautomation is to do it quickly. But equally, what you don't want to do is get that slightly out of control. And there's some really good ways of managing that within most of the tools today to make sure you can take advantage of that, but put a good process or governance layer over the top.
So just on that, I've seen it done well, and I've seen it done not so well, where people have rushed into the delivery, and maybe elements of the automation's worked, but there's elements that have been missed. Now that's a really important point, that stakeholder engagement up front, understanding what your measures of success up front, and including the compliance, and putting those in place right at the outset. That's kind of what I've heard there.
Yeah, and there's probably 3 or 4 things that you want to look at. So some organisations might run a technical design authority and a functional design authority where you're making a mix of technical and business decisions together, because it's always going to be a mix of the two. You have to have a good business reason to want to do the automation alongside a good technical framework for the actual delivery itself. And those two things have to be quite tightly managed. I think we'll hear a little bit more about that later when Anthony talks, because he's got some really good use cases in terms of around making sure that the business process is tightly aligned to the technical process in order to get the most out of the delivery. So I think it's important to have both levels of both sizes. And I think Keith, from a technical implementation standpoint on the governance, there's quite a lot you can do within the tooling itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Aaron mentioned again the importance of the governance framework, and I think for me personally, although in a moment I'll touch on the technology and how you can implement the right way the first time and then not paint yourself into a corner down the track, it is important to understand why you're doing something, where you're trying to get to, and why Then you can get to the specifics of the what, and lastly the how, right? There is a tendency for people to jump in too quickly to build. Now, time to value is important, and there's a lot of awareness in the industry in terms of improving time to value, pilot programs, POCs, and let's prove the payback to gain approval for a larger program of work. That's all well and good, but if you rush in, you can deliver some value initially, but then as you start to get through the gears and you want to scale, so that it's not a point solution, it's not tactical, it's part of a broader program of work, you end up in a set of knots, right? Because you've built stuff which is brittle, it's difficult to extend, difficult to maintain, you start to regret your earlier shortcuts. And at the time, they're not always obvious, right? So what we're trying to do is, I guess, give you the benefit of the experience we've had working across different industries, different geographies, different clients. But yeah, I'd say, building with reuse in mind is absolutely critical. Having an abstraction layer, not building, you might be building with one goal in mind, with one use case in mind, but don't limit yourself to only fulfilling that one use case. Build it with a view that every use case you execute should be easier than the last, because the level of reuse is going up. What you should be looking to do is to build out a set of artifacts or building blocks in your integration platform that then are the base building blocks or ingredients of anything that you build thereafter. So absolutely critical to success is building with reuse and repeat use cases in mind. If you do that, it might feel like you need to spend a little bit more time on architecture and design. I am a fan of the TDA if done properly. It doesn't have to be overly bureaucratic, but yeah, the hours that you spend on the architecture and design up front will save you 10x on the build down the track, and you will start to accelerate up the curve. So each use case should be faster than the last, and then your cost of delivery will go down and the value you unlock in the business will go up.
Keith, with that in mind, how do you, any particular advice on the speed, how do you, the challenge between delivering quick and maybe delivering once and proving your kind of MVP and here's how we can do something in the future, but if it's all throwaway, actually it makes a really big project going thereafter. So I guess any particular advice on how you want a reusable process, which bits to focus on, which bits not to worry too much about? Any particular thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing, and it's obvious really, is don't start from a blank canvas, right? Although when you go into the product, there is literally a blank canvas. You don't have to start there, and you shouldn't start there. We have a comprehensive library of what we call process templates and integration recipes, and we also have personalised versions of those that we field tested with particular clients in particular industries. So if you come to us or KTSL, we can give you that jump start, view it as a solution accelerator or a rapid deployment solution. It gives you a starting point. So you should be looking for maybe 60 to 80% of the solution to be scaffolded out and built, and then the last mile, as it were, is about the localization and personalization for your particular business and or set of use cases. So when you think about really what you're trying to do from an integration and automation standpoint, aside from the business-specific logic, and although most businesses, kind of like to feel as though they're unique and different and there isn't another company like that on the face of the earth, the reality is there are lots of similar businesses out there with similar automation challenges. So chances are you're not crossing that bridge for the first time, right? Somebody else has solved that problem. So there are a lot of architectural blueprints, reference architectures, integration patterns that we can refer to, which are proven, time tested, and then we have specific examples as to how you would, embody those in our technology set. So don't start from a blank sheet of paper, because if you do that, A, you're going the long way around, which is not a good idea generally speaking, but B, it increases the chances for you to make mistakes and go down dead ends, etc. So yeah, try to build up a library of reusable artifacts that then become the base building blocks for every integration afterwards. What matters more than almost anything else is consistency. I mean, Aaron mentioned uniformity, right? If you can have a lot of good people in your team, skilled, experienced individuals approach the same problem different ways, and each of those independently could be good and perfectly fine, but it's the lack of consistency once you start to look across the piece that will bite you. So try to have a style guide and certain guidelines that they're not prescriptive, but it just gives the right sort of level of consistency and control over the way you build automations in your business.
Okay, great, thank you. So moving on, we've got everybody probably, in order to get any piece of work done, we've all got to get a business case together. So we've done that initial piece of work, we've put a business case together, hopefully we've all got it signed off and we've gone into implementation. So I guess the key thing then, and you mentioned governance right at the start, Aaron, what's kind of best practice around measurements? What do you measure? How do you measure it? Where do you capture that? Because you want to prove your business case, number one. Number two, you want to know what's working, what isn't working, so you can adjust and refine as you go. So in terms of measurements, I don't know maybe who's best to pick that up, but what's your kind of thoughts on how you measure the right things?
Yeah, look, I think ultimately the reason we want to look at automations aren't we to improve end user experience. Now, whether we're classifying an end user as an actual end user or whether it's internal within our business, what we're trying to do is reduce our mean time to resolution, regardless of how that sits. And
Unless you're in finance, and then it's cost reduction, yeah.
That's true. But that's the ultimate metric, right? You know, in terms of any industry that's providing a service to a part of its business or to an end user. So in particular IT, because IT in most organisation is providing a service. That's what IT is there for. That's the most critical measure. And obviously the best way of doing that is to have the problem resolved before it even happens. So you're looking at proactive problem management. You're looking at some of what I touched on earlier on in terms of AI ops, calling in automation. So the best problem is one that nobody spots. But beyond that, what you're trying to do is say, okay, has my automation actually saved time in the delivery of that service to my end customer? And we'll hear a little bit from Ian from M Group later, who's going to talk around some processes where they've implemented, which has done exactly that. It's had a huge saving to their service levels. And I won't stay thunder so you can talk through the detail later. But that's what you're trying to look for ultimately. So, you know, within the ITSM landscape, we're quite service level driven. So whether that's SLA and OLA, underpinning contract, all of those are really important measures for us within our industry. And that's what we're ultimately guided by in terms of whether our automation's been a success or not. So when you start to see that scale, you can see how much difference you've made to the business. Ultimately, yeah, there should be a financial saving as well. So, you know, you'll have a level of investment that's gone into the automation platform and you should get a level of return. So a good example, maybe we did some recently for a customer. It was just around mainframe application permission access. It sounds like quite small and quite niche. But they had an underlying cost of that, which was £250,000 a year, just to have somebody that set up mainframe application permissions. So that was fully automated. Two real measures there. One with the cost saving, which we could show on return of value by the reduction in tickets that were being picked up manually and dealt with. They were now done through the automation. And then the second measure there was the user experience, because rather than it taking an hour to 2 hours to get picked up by somebody within a queue, it was dealt with within 5 minutes from the point at which it was approved. So there were two really important metrics, and I guess most people will be familiar with measuring them, but they're going to be the ones that you want to push back up to the board to get further funding, because they're the two things that people care about, cost and experience. And if you cover off those two metrics, that's where you're going to get more investment to do more with the strategy and more with automation. And there's other fringe benefits of that. So in quite a lot of organisations, most customers are trying to push to either a chatbot style deployment or a portal deployment to sort of remove the need for phone or worst case email, because that's even more unstructured. But what you try to do is drive people that way. And one of the key ways of driving somebody to use a portal is if they get it faster. So we go to a lot of organisations and they'll talk about, we need to make our user portal really user-friendly and it needs to look pretty and it needs to be something that people want to come to. It's like, yeah, but pretty is good for a little while and then you'll get bored of it and it's like, just ring again. Whereas actually if I go to the portal and I select something and I get it in 5 minutes, whereas if I ring somebody, I'm sat on the phone for 5 minutes, then a call gets logged, then it goes to somebody else for another 10 minutes, then I might get it within half an hour if I'm lucky. I'll use the portal again because I'm getting a better user experience. And even if it looks more simplistic, people are still going to go and use it because you're driven by something that gives you value more quickly. You look at some websites that are really popular. They don't always look the greatest. eBay's a great example. I think the interface is awful. But it doesn't stop them being really successful in e-commerce. And why? Because it's just an easy-to-use interface. It does you enough what I want, and I can get to the point at which I want to bid or buy something very quickly. So you can get away with the fact that it's rough around the edges because it's still doing the job. And that's the same thing within the portal. The more automation you can push through, the more adoption you get, and then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you increase your portal adoption rates, you then by turn increase your amount of automation that you're driving, which therefore you're getting more value out of the investment that you've made, and therefore your business case becomes ever stronger, because you can push and say, well look, we've already got 98% of our calls logged through the portal. I could drive more automation therefore by extending my remit, and therefore my business case becomes more self-fulfilling. And it's that type of joined up thinking I would be using as a typical measure for success.
Yeah, Tim. This on? Yep. It's interesting. In the past, I ran large tech support teams, customer service teams, and as part of our customer experience improvement program, we did a lot of work with Gartner, and there was a lot of research that said that delighting customers was a false economy. That wasn't something you should aim to do. It's a real kind of diminishing returns plan. What customers wanted is they wanted it to do what they wanted it to do, and they wanted it to do it quick. So it was all about effort. How much effort have I got to spend being a customer and involved in this process? So we designed all our processes about getting them on and off the kind of phone, ticket, whatever it was, and it had a massive increase in customer experience and customer score. So yeah, 100% agree. People just want it to work and work well. And I'll pass your feedback to Jeff Bezos about the Amazon interface as well. So Keith, I guess similarly, I guess building on that, in terms of projects that Jitterbit have delivered, what have you seen customers really appreciate in terms of value, the value they've got from the hyper-automation or the automation that's been delivered?
Yeah, okay, so I think maybe adding on to what Aaron has already said, self-service needs to be a win-win, right? There needs to be something in it for me, the business, the stakeholders who sponsor the programme, and that's when you should baseline the key metrics which are then later going to use to prove success. But there has to be something in it for the consumer as well, right? And it might be, as Aaron said, initially a slick user experience, but actually it's got to be about getting the thing I need and care about more quickly and effectively. So if it's instant fulfillment autonomously off the back of self-service, then that's 24/7. I don't need to wait in line. You know, I can get what I need, I can move on. That's the way the world has gone with the consumerisation of IT, like it or not. The business world just needs to kind of, you know, finish catching up with the personal lives that people now are used to in terms of their interactions with technology. But from a Jitterbit standpoint, I'd say we probably see customers fitting into one of three scenarios. There are customers who want to drive cost out of the business. That's an obvious one, right? So we can look at things like the cost per case, a cost per transaction, depending on, you know, the type of business process we're talking about. There can be other run cost type situations if it leads to things not tying up your expensive resources, you know, for as long because they're, you know, cutting through quicker than, you know, the actual overall cost can be driven down. That might free up capacity to take on more business transactions, or it might just reduce the you know, the cash out the door from a company standpoint. We also see customers bringing in automation technologies to be able to do something for the first time they're currently not able to do. It's not always about, hey, look, can we digitize something which is manual or semi-automated and make it more effective or lower cost. It can be about being able to do something new for the first time. We've seen a lot of businesses, especially spurred on by pandemic and various other macroeconomic factors, have to kind of almost reinvent themselves and catch up with new disruptive entries into the market. So, you know, there are people who are the first movers and maybe disrupt a marketplace, but there are also people who then have to, you know, keep pace with those innovators. And then the third one, which we're seeing more and more on, thankfully, are the very successful fast growth businesses that then want to scale the number of customers that they can, or transactions they can cope with. Maybe that's part of going international or global, but they don't want a corresponding scaling in costs, right? So they want to be able to handle more business transactions per, you know, headcount or FTE or agent or whatever it might be, depending on the department we're talking to. Yeah, a continuation off the back of COVID for us has been a you know, vast increase in the amount of e-commerce related activities, and not just the obvious, you know, front line web shop type stuff, but the whole logistics industry, third party logistics, fulfillment, been a huge boom in that part of the world for us personally. So a lot of use cases around, you know, moving boxes around more effectively at a lower cost and providing better service to consumers.
Okay, that's great. And from an IT service management perspective, Aaron, what are you seeing as the kind of big automation drivers in ITSM?
I think in ITSM, just being more proactive. I think over the last 2 years, it's really changed. So ITSM has always been quite a reactive industry, just by its very nature. Tickets come into a tool, and once they're there, you're always going to be reactive in the way that you deal with them. I think with the advent of AI's growth, we could be much more clever with how we manage our volume within our ITSM now. And customers are starting to move to a much more of a proactive state, so stopping things occurring at source. You've got much better understanding of how everything is knitted together now in terms of your business impact, because you can pre-populate a lot of what used to be maybe manually maintained within your configuration management database, and now you've got the point where that should be automated. I should understand impact immediately. I can understand what my business process I'm affected to my end customer, rather than relying on somebody to go through that and sift and understand what that risk or that impact was. And that dial has shifted massively. In the last 12 months, if I look at the number of proactive projects that we've kicked off with customers, where we may be leveraging AI ops, or we may be leveraging data insight management. Again, as I mentioned earlier, things like DEX tools, it's shifted the dial. So I would expect most organisations now to be starting to get a much proactive handle on what's happening within their business and cutting that noise out before it gets to the point of being what would have been a reactive ticket. And that's a real step change in ITSM over the last 12 months. And it makes sense, right? Because back to said, the best problem is one that nobody knows about. So you can handle that internally, you can get rid of it. And a lot of those types of issues tend to be the ones that are repetitive, because if they're coming from an infrastructure side, they're things that there's no reason why you can't get rid of them, because they're not falling down because of a process, they're not falling down because of a different way of working. They are being driven out of an infrastructure standpoint, which means by their very nature, they are driven out of something that's repeatable, because a machine can only act the same way with the same input every single time. It doesn't alter the way it behaves. So therefore, they're the perfect candidates, both for driving that volume away, but also for bringing in a level of automation to remove it. And it's a massive step change. And I think some of it's going to change the way that we perceive how we do service management moving forward, because we've often spoken about maintaining what can be quite a monolithic CFDB to understand everything that's moving and everything that's happening, and let's get it down to the X level because it's important. But actually now there's technologies that can make those leaps of faith for us. So what we have to make sure we do now is maintain our services, understand what's critical, understand what's important, but let's leverage the technology to do the detail for us, to do that heavy lifting that previously we had to do. There's a huge opportunity to streamline that whole management of those services. And I find it really exciting. Maybe it's because that's the industry I've been in, maybe I'm quite dull, but it's like, it's just moving that shift forward to bringing that ability just to get on top of something before it even gets to that level is so important. And there's so much opportunity in that space. And I think that term, hyperautomation, has been around a couple of years, but I think only over the last year, with the influx of the technology sort of catching up, can we truly use the term hyper rather than it's just automation. The whole point is it should be faster, it should be giving us better volume savings, it should be quicker to implement, it should be more proactive, it should be self-fulfilling, it should understand where our issues are. That's what makes it hyper-automation, as opposed to purely just automation integration that we would have done for years. That's the real shift in what I see as a change in the industry, and that's what we really need to start driving forward over the next 2 or 3 years.
And that means understanding your data is critical, right? That's the whole observability conversation, is you need to understand what data is affecting what in order to be able to be proactive.
Yeah, and understanding where your trusted source is coming from. That hasn't gone away. That is still really important. Understanding how you're going to manage that data, understanding where it is, understanding the impact of that. And I spoke earlier on about compliance. With DORA and NIST, you have to have controls over that, and you have to understand where it is. But you could do that in so many different ways now than you could previously. That gives you the opportunity to do that much more readily and more quickly. And then back to the governance model that I guess we both spoke about at the start, alongside the business process. You can knit all of that together, use the technology opportunities that you've got, put the governance wrap around it, so you're making the tools you do have work for you, because in some cases I go to organisations and they've got 4 AI ops tools, 17 event managers, 3 discovery tools, and it's quite hard to get a handle over the top of it. So you then end up knitting them together to get a good picture. But with the right governance, you should be able to say, okay, I understand where my data is coming from. I understand what my golden source for that data is. I understand how I can interact with that and drive more efficiency from it, and therefore I'm going to get better value.
Okay, great. We've probably got about, in our little slot here, about 5 minutes of this little piece. You probably heard quite a lot around the kind of whole process there, from identifying governance, deployment, measurement, etc. I mean, I'm guessing people in the room have got either projects they're looking at, or to the possible that they're thinking about, challenges they've got within their business. I'm assuming there must be some questions. So, I mean, nobody wants to ask the first question. It wouldn't do any harm if you put your hand up. You ask the question, I'll repeat it so we can hear it on the mic.
How do you unpick an estate that's maybe 20, 25 years old? A bit earlier you talked about governance and how it's important to create reusability. And if it's greenfield, I think it's a lot more straightforward because you can do it from the outset. But what would you do to unpick an estate that has been built upon and built upon and built upon? So you end up in that end state, the desired end state.
So just to repeat the question then, so where you've got an estate that's kind of aged 25 years or you know, built on and built on and built on, how do you unpick that to start the process?
I think it's a good question, Tom. I think for me, there's 2 ways that I would start with that. So I'd say the more traditional way, where you would sit down and start to interview process owners, IT service owners, to understand how their businesses fit together. Now, in some cases, they'll have a level of documentation which you can use as a starting point. In other cases, they won't. But you'll do a level of business analysis to start to understand how their applications are knit together. I think the second way you can do it, and I guess this is something we can do more recently, is there's lots of opportunities now to ingest data that they already have. So they may have it in 5, 6 different systems, but there's the opportunity to pull that together, probably put that through a level of AI in order to correlate that data into one output file. Because a lot of that type of data ingestion and data analysis now could be done regardless of the underlying system. And there's enough data models that are available now to get a really good understanding. So whether it's legacy or whether it's new, you can push that through and correlate it together. I would do that alongside the more traditional interview style process, because between the two, you'll get a really good understanding quite quickly. So even if it's legacy, I think you can build up that picture. And even with some organisations, let's say some of the legacy elements are not documented quite so well because maybe they've fallen outside the compliance life cycle. There's no reason why those approaches still don't work between a mix of that interviewing and non-interviewing. Another different shift now, let's take an organisation where maybe you're not talking about traditional IT, but you're talking about maybe things like medical equipment, or you're talking about field engineer equipment, maybe something that falls outside of the IT norm. With the advent of the Internet of Things, which I know is a buzzword that some people like and some people don't, but regardless of that, we have the opportunity now to discover endpoints above and beyond what we would have done traditionally. So sometimes within the legacy field, there's an opportunity to, again, leverage that type of technology, because sometimes you can find things that are still on the network or still exist, maybe quite outside of the norm for IT, but are there for quite good legacy reasons. And again, you can bring that data into that fold to understand that picture and that pattern. And then again, once you do that, you're back to probably where we started, which is then justifying your business case based on volume, because you would have seen that volume from those legacy systems by pulling that data in, running that analysis, sitting down, and then starting to construct a business case and a use case. And as you start to do that, you can start to bring in more and more and more of the legacy systems. And I would always start with it. Even in a legacy environment, you're still going to have your top 20, right? Most organizations can tell you what are their top 20 critical systems. Okay, that's where you're going to get the most benefit from any level of automation. So start there. And you should be able to get there quite quickly in terms of understanding how are they used and how are they being maintained, and where the things that you're doing that are repetitive within those. And again, it's a case of then building it through the rest of the processes that we've spoken about.
Yeah, maybe just to pick up where Aaron left off there, it's important to know where you're starting from, right? So take stock of what you've got, have an inventory, but then I would say look at the life cycle management of those assets, start to understand the life expectancy of the different classifications of assets that you might have. Are they in early life? Are they in the kind of the main period of their existence? Are they in the retirement phase? Are they past retirement? A lot of more mature legacy businesses will have systems which should have been retired. They can't be for some reason or other. So one of the advantages that you have now with modern technologies is that you can put a modernization layer on top of legacy and then extend its useful life. Some of those assets you're going to have to find a way to extend their life and then find a way to provide a vehicle to support them, even if the vendor support isn't there and maybe the vendor itself doesn't exist. That's quite common in the finance world, for example. But yeah, starting to just have a life cycle management policy that makes you a good custodian of your assets and look at how you can then deal with them differently at different points in their journey. But try to get to a point that you've got abstraction layers and then you can work with modern open standards instead of proprietary, complex interfaces which pull you back into the legacy world, because as you'd imagine, most of the modern tooling now is geared towards modern technology and open standards, so it doesn't play particularly well if you start going back 10, 20 years in technology terms. So trying to find a way to bridge that technology gap and manage assets at more of an abstract level is a good way to approach the problem.
Yeah, I know over the years you've done a number of different acquisitions and you acquire technical debt and it becomes a long-term problem where you never really address it. So it's good advice. Questions from anybody else? What any particular problems that people are dealing with? Any particular opportunities that you're looking at that, maybe they've heard something today that might be interesting?
Hi. One of the problems I think we're facing with a lot of this is when it comes to the critical systems he talks about, is we want to understand the top 10, top 20 critical systems so we can address those and start to try and drive that cost down and, be able to sell the value of the products that we want to continue to invest in so we don't end up going backwards, which is a worry from service management because sometimes the operational side of things, they don't quite have the same vision. The problem we have is we're not trusted to go near the critical systems until we've proven ourselves. So it's a slow, slow progress to get to that point, and then the people start to doubt the value, I guess. Is there any advice as to how to overcome that?
So just to repeat the question, Tiffany was keen to get to the top 10 systems and really start to add value, but to do that, the team have got to prove their worth, if you like, and they've got to prove their worth on a small scale, which takes time, and the whole thing starts to lose momentum, I think, if that's summed up right. Is that thoughts on how you might address that?
Yeah, I mean, it is a good question, and I guess some of that is maybe down particularly with some of the more modern technologies, the level of trust in terms of, particularly, when we talk about AI with organisations, there's still a level of mistrust within some organisations to let that touch their critical business systems, and it is a very valid point. What I would be looking at there is something that has volume that maybe sits outside of your top 10. So good examples like, and I know I used one about sort of shared application permissions or something like an application password reset, something that's unlikely to impact the system itself, but still going to give you a volume play. What you don't want to do is pick a POC on something that's too small, both in terms of volume and criticality, because then you don't hit the business case. So you need to make sure, I think I would say that in that scenario, volume becomes maybe more important than the criticality, because if you could still show a benefit in terms of the volume, you're still going to get a cost business case, and then you're more likely then to get the sign-off in terms of moving towards a critical system, and in order to move that process forward. Another way to look at it, we take a non-critical process against that critical system. So, for example, a good way of doing that is to use something like synthetic transactions, for example, a really good way of proving that. So you might take a critical business system that you use, you might invoke a synthetic transaction against it, so not an actual downtime, but you're simulating what would happen. You then show how a level of automation could have picked that up and dealt with it, but you're not impinging on the actual system. So sometimes that can work really well. So a good example of that, say in the finance industry, would be something that's like 0.00001p through a banking transaction process. You can reverse it. You're not going to impact that from a criticality point of view, but you can still prove that had that transaction failed, you've got the opportunity to roll that back. And in most organisations, particularly if you have a QA example of that system, you've got the opportunity to run that through either dev or QA, and therefore allow that synthetic transaction to run, call that automation outside of that process, and then still have that prove your level of automation, or prove your level of automation, or prove the business case. Maybe I just use my voice, but prove your business case or your use case in terms of that dev QA environment, but also then prove that value, because what you're doing is picking something that's still showing it your ability to manage that critical component. So that synthetic transaction model is really, really powerful. And again, that's something that's probably used a lot more in the last 3 or 4 years, because it's become much easier to sort of run that type of transaction now than it ever used to be. And it's a good way of sort of saying, well, okay, we're going to interface with that system to prove the value, but we're not going to touch it, right? We're running something that's not going to cause an issue. But even if you can't get to that far, then picking a high volume use case outside of those critical business services would be the other way that I would go.
That woke me up.
Sorry, Keith, anything to add?
I was going to say, I mean, I'm not sure if there are any SAP customers in the room, but picking up on what Aaron's just said with synthetic transactions, SAP, the ERP system now, has a number of APIs which you can run in simulate mode. And one of the things I usually do with clients when we're automating end-to-end, and it could fit well with ITSM, so let's say self-service, it might be procuring some new laptop or mobile device, whatever. Eventually there needs to be a purchase requisition, and maybe it's going to be able to approve the fulfill, but you can run a simulate process in SAP to give you a response as to whether or not that transaction would have been successful if you were to commit it for real. Now what I do initially in sort of the pilot phase or the hypercare phase normally is do the simulate. If it responds positively, commit it for real. If it responds in a negative sense, put the brakes on, offboard it, route it to the team who can intervene and figure out what went wrong. But if in this scenario where you're almost trying to prove that it would work successfully with zero blowback, you could just run simulate only, and then take the output file and say, look, SAP said that would have been okay. Here's a copy of the file that you would have had. Give that to the SAP functionalist, have them sign off on it. It gives the confidence then for you to do something that would otherwise be normally quite a guarded affair. So yeah, kind of go through the process if you can, and then you should get the blessing, I would hope, to go deliver the business value.
Sounds easy.
Hello. Oh, yeah, we're back.
Your Bermuda Triangle of not working mic there. Any other questions? Any other challenges that people have got, or projects that they're looking at? They might be able to ask questions while we're here.
Or do people all want tea?
Is that a vote for tea, or is that?
Answer the question.
No, go on.
How important is it to, so I'm assuming the understanding is you have a good understanding of what your business process is before, we were talking about process and volumes, and obviously using the high volumes to do the automation, or high automation. So how important is it for a business to understand the components, both hardware and software, involved in that business process to essentially optimize and then automate? Or does optimization come as a result of the automation? Is it chicken and egg?
So yeah, just to repeat the question for people at the back. So how important is it to understand the hardware and software components of the process in order to be able to take advantage of automation? Is that summed up right? Yeah.
I don't mind taking that one initially. I'd say it's important that somebody understands the business process. It doesn't necessarily have to be at a low level in terms of the hardware and software that might, underpin that process. So Aaron spoke earlier about business analysis. I think if you were to kind of putting process mining aside and automated discovery for a second, somebody ought to be in a position to do the business process mapping and ideally re-engineering, because just simply automating the current process isn't always going to yield the biggest gains, right? I mean, you might get some efficiencies, but you can be hindered just simply because it's not the right process in the first place, or the process hasn't stood the test of time as the organisation has changed. So I'd say don't be scared to challenge the status quo and look for improvements in the process, and then try to execute that process more effectively in terms of the right tool for the job.
Yeah, and I think back in terms of following what Keith just said on into doing the optimization, what you will find is if you start to automate the process, and then what you'll tend to find when you do that is you'll find more bottlenecks as you go that you may not have seen before, particularly where you have a multi-layered or multi-transaction style approach to that process. Because as you start to do that automation, you'll see other levers to then bring in that optimization. Particularly, again, if you're seeing a common fault within part of the process that may be back to the hardware or the infrastructure that you're running, you'll highlight then an opportunity to maybe optimize that. And again, as you sort of expand that out then across multiple processes, you may find that that same bottleneck is occurring in point 2, 3, 4, and 5. And therefore, one single change to that gives you optimization across the board, and then you start to get more value. I don't like the term fail fast. It's not a term I particularly like. What I would prefer to say is, even if you're succeeding a small bit, do that quickly. That's, I think, a better way of putting that concept. Because
Not fail slow.
no, don't fail slow. That's the worst of both worlds. But don't be too nervous about trying to get an initial automation, even if you're covering part of the process, because that still gives you a benefit. And back to what your question around there for how do you see what else you could do, you'll start to open up a few more doors. So even if I can't take this process end to end, I can't do all of the automation now, it's too much, too complex, we've got too much historical debt, back to the legacy question, what you could do is say, okay, I'm just going to take it from point B to point C, I'm going to leave A and I'm going to leave D in an F manual. Get that right, but then actually it gives me the opportunity to optimize that, and now I can see a way from C to D. And if we could start to grow that out, so you're still bringing value to the business, it might not be the complete value that you're aiming for initially, but you're starting to bring that forward, and therefore you're going to get a level of optimization by doing so.
And maybe just quickly, if it's not the case that the last two legs of the journey there are complete blockers, but maybe 80% of the transactions can clear end to end, try and automate a certain percentage of the transactional volume, and then out of band deal with the ones that won't clear those last couple of legs. So either way round, approach it in phases with the final destination in mind, and then you do get to a better place quicker, but ultimately you will get to where you want to.
Thanks, Keith. Thanks, Sarah. So I think that wraps up the first part of the session. Going to take a break. There's coffees and teas and water. It's just after hot. Say, take 10 minutes. Or kind of give us a shout on the mic. So have a break, and we'll catch up with our customers afterwards. Thanks.
It's not the battery.